attention on the pay-per-view. Heyman stated a week before at UFC 116 that wasn't happening, and it didn't happen. I know you weren't exactly in the office here, but how close do you believe this came to actually becoming a reality? Was it ever that close, do you think, Heyman coming?
This podcast, even before this, he was the conduit to show. Like, and is that really your first sort? I was spending a lot more time over in Japan. I was there a couple times a year. I was doing a lot of business with the business side of New Japan and just studying the way that they operated. And one of the things that I know that the product was treated with much more respect. It was by media, and that was due in large part because of the way it was presented. It was a more reality-based product, from the action that you saw in the ring to the characters themselves, the performers themselves, and the way they carried themselves at every level. It was just a much more respected business. And I kind of boiled the meat off the bone, and what became apparent to me is it was treated with that kind of respect because the product was more real. It was just more believable. And that was the genesis. That's where I was influenced, not by an invasion angle. Quite frankly, I wasn't even aware of an invasion angle if there was one going on over there. I know that's the urban narrative, and I know that's what people want to believe, and people that want to take shots at me or the NWO, WCW, whatever. I know that that's where they derive a lot of that perspective from. But the truth is, I studied the New Japan way of doing business. I took away that it was more reality-based, and that's what I was most influenced by, and where basically that led to me trying to create in my own mind, that transition. How do I take this very cartoony, animated product, which WWF was at the time, and frankly so was WCW. How do I take this product here in the United States and replicate the formula that was working so well in Japan?
Well, let's talk about the Diamond Dallas Page connection, because I feel like that's a critical part of the story, especially when it comes to getting Scott Hall and Kevin Nash over. Who called who? What were those conversations like? And is that really your first sort of, aha, maybe I'm on to something here with this realism that I've been looking for? Maybe this is how we could put a razor's edge, so to speak, on this angle.
Well, the timeline was for a period of time, and I'm not sure whether it was a year or so, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, is when my goal was, frankly, to try to figure out a way to create a more reality-based storyline, as I just talked about. Coincidentally, and it really was a coincidence, one day I was sitting at home, I believe it was, a nice Saturday afternoon, and, Paige shows up in my driveway. Yobi, gotta talk to you, which was a very common occurrence, quite frankly. I only lived about 2 houses away from him, so it was kind of habitual on his part to interrupt my weekends. But Scott and DDP talked a lot, and Paige came to me and said, look, I just got off the phone with Scott Hall. He's interested in making a jump. Would you be interested in talking to him? So I said, sure, if he's ready to make a move, I'm happy to do it. And yes, DDP did, he was the catalyst, he was the conduit to start that process.
When it came to Kevin Nash, was he also the catalyst for that, or was that an introduction that Scott made?
No, I didn't really deal too much with Scott. Even though I knew Scott, and I worked at WCW, I first came into WCW when Scott was there as the Diamond Stud or whatever it was. I never really talked to Scott that much. I did have a little bit of a relationship with Kevin, but it started with DDP, but I quickly started talking directly to Kevin because, like I said, I had a relationship with Kevin before he left WCW. Little known fact, right as I started really getting a little bit of influence in WCW, it might have been right after I was made executive producer, not exactly sure on the date of it, I sat down with Kevin, and tried to figure out where his head was at, and make sure he was. I wanted to make sure he was sort of, be a part of the roster because we were trying to plan our stuff. And he looked me right in the eye and said, "No, man, I'm staying here." And about a week later, he was gone. And I understood why. I got it. I didn't take it personally, but I did start talking to Kevin directly a little bit sooner in the process.
So let's talk about that. When you're having conversations with guys who are technically under contract to the WWF, are you not nervous about there being some sort of claim for tampering? I mean, you guys were really going back and forth even before this angle happened, at least in the legal system. Was there any sort of hesitation or, hey, we better make sure that we're sort of quiet about this? Or what's the thinking at the time?
Well, at the time, and again, I'll say this probably frequently as we're doing these, context is king. This was before the Monday Night Wars. This was before the head-to-head, certainly before the trademark litigation between WCW and WWE. We were, quite frankly, probably viewed as a pimple on a hamster's ass by the WWE at this point. So there was no real concern. The term the legal term is tortious interference. A tort claim is a serious claim, but it wasn't one that anybody was really too concerned about. There was talent going back and forth all the time. There was talent from WCW talking to WWE on a regular basis, and vice versa. I made sure that when I did speak to them, it was on the basis that, if and when you decide to leave, yes, if and when that would happen, yes, we would be interested, and we might have even talked general numbers, but at that time, it just really wasn't that treacherous to do so.
So I find it interesting that you say that at the time, there really wasn't a feud necessarily. I mean, you were a pimple on the ass of the WWF, but you guys are running the Billionaire Ted skits, the Huckster, and the Nacho Man. I mean, all of that stuff had been on the other channels, allegedly with you guys sort of sending letters back and forth with each other. Can you confirm as to whether or not you had communication with Vince McMahon or his office about those skits?
Well, you're jumping around in the timeline a little bit. We just went from when I first started talking to Scott and Kevin to deep into the Monday Night Wars, and a lot of things changed, within that timeline. Again, we're going back to when I first talked to Kevin, I first talked to Scott. No, I wasn't concerned about tortious interference because there was really no legal back and forth at that time. Later on, when we started kicking their ass, and after we saw Scott and Kevin, come out as a part of the NWO, or what was going to become the NWO, and once the NWO, materialized and manifested on our television, then of course there were lawsuits. There was a lot of shit going on that got a lot more serious and put everybody on notice that we had to be a lot more careful about the way we did business. To answer your question, did I respond or did I send a letter? I'm not sure if I did or not. I recall kind of as a half-assed joke, making a couple phone calls. I think I even called Vince McMahon once in his office. I got his assistant and tried to get a call through, and I don't think he wanted to take it. I know that the legal department, certainly sent some letters, but I wasn't privy to that. I didn't really, they kind of kept me out of the loop. The legal side of the business did when it came to that kind of stuff. I may have gotten CC'd on something. I'm sure I did, but I wasn't really privy to it.
For the record, the Billionaire Ted skit started on January 8th, and Scott gave us notice on February 20th. So I got my shit together, bro. Let's talk about that.
Whoa, wait a minute. Let's bring that back. Scott may have given his notice when Scott gave his notice, but he didn't appear on television until May 27th. I don't really give a damn what happened between February and May. When did we get when did the lawsuit start? When did the Billionaire Ted skit start?
Billionaire Ted started in January of 1996. Scott gave notice February 20th, and he showed up in late May.
I'll go with that.
All right, so one for Conrad if you're keeping score at home. Now, according to Scott, the WWF contract...
I'll hate this show.
Yeah, this is going to be shorter lived than the Ric Flair show. According to Scott, the WWF contracts at the time were like 10 dates for $1,500, and you really only earn like paying you based on the houses, a pay-per-view bonus again at his discretion, and he got a piece of the merchandise, but no guaranteed money. And eventually, that his income had seemingly plateaued. And Vince said there's really nothing that Scott could do to earn more money, and allegedly even told Scott he couldn't go to Japan to earn some extra cash. So then Scott asked a third time for more money, maybe this time on his merchandise, and again, Vince turns him down. Is that really the crux of the conversation with you and Scott? That, hey man, I'm happy here, but I need to make more money. It's not necessarily a jump for creative. It's, hey, I want fewer dates and I want more money. Is that about right?
Nope.
Glad you made it.
Now again, I didn't.
Place where my people seek salvage is closed. As are the hostile machines.
I didn't really
Follow
care.
if you will.
Lead the way.
He made it clear he wanted to make the move, but he never really told me why. He never shared with me why he wasn't happy with the details that you just
I've
shared.
hunted this forest since I was a boy.
So now,
When the clans were at
know
war,
that
Chikata and I helped hold it from the lowlanders. It was one of the few battles that Carl ever
So
lost.
Scott winds up giving
Didn't you say
notice on
Jakarta was
February
emotional?
20th, and he does this having received a signed letter
Later,
of
he
intent
came to
from
respect
WCW
Jakarta's
for what Meltzer reported at the time as a
volunteered for
$500,000
the very first
guarantee.
coup.
And not long
I was
after Scott put his
melancholy.
notice in,
Glad to see the
the
chief.
WWF tells him he failed the piss
But he
test
came
and
back
sent
often.
him off.
And I was
Scott
always
says
glad
this was
when he
actually
did.
an old test, and they just pulled it out after he put his notice in
There,
to muddy the
the
waters.
sheets.
Before we talk about the letter of intent, I want to know,
Cauldrons
what's your reaction to the news here? Do you feel like Scott's trying to tell you about the test failure to sort of play damage control and spin it? Or what's your reaction when you hear about this failed drug test for a guy you already have a deal in place for?
You know what? I'll be honest with you. This is the first time I'm hearing this. It made absolutely no impression on me. I wasn't worried about it.
Let's talk about a letter of intent, because a lot of our listeners may not be familiar with the phrase, and I know that Kevin Nash has sometimes referred to these as quote-unquote a deal memo. Break down what those terms are for some of our listeners who may not be familiar.
Well, a deal memo and a letter of intent can be exactly the same thing. It's basically a summary of the parties' intentions to enter into a long-form agreement. They can either be binding or non-binding, depending on what the parties want them to be. But it's essentially, I still use it today to summarize deal points so that you can move forward into a long-form agreement without having to burn up a lot of attorney time going back and forth on little things. Just, you know, in the beginning phase of a deal, quite common, and they were really common back then.
Does the $500,000 figure sound about right to the best of your recollection?
Yeah, that does sound right. And the reason I remember that, quite frankly, is, you know, Sting was our highest paid talent at that time. He was making about $750, not about, he was making $750. Ric Flair was in there at either 4 or 5. I think he would have been at 5. And I knew I couldn't bring Scott and Kevin in at more than Ric Flair, and I certainly didn't want to bring them in there at Sting's rate. So I think the 5 is right. That's what I recall, and it would make sense.
I'm glad you brought up Sting, because when Scott goes to Kevin and tells him that he's leaving, Kevin asks, hey, what are they offering? And Scott says half the date for quote-unquote Sting money. When do you remember the phrase Sting money becoming a thing?
It was never a thing with me. I mean, there was, you know, we had a budget in place that had been approved the year before by the Turner Broadcasting Finance Committee. So I knew, you know, the parameters that I had to work within. I knew that just politically, you know, from a locker room perspective, there was no way that I could bring these two guys in at more than Ric Flair. Even if Ric wouldn't have been there, I wouldn't have been at Sting's rates. To the hole!
coming!
Looks like the hunt's not over yet.
For me, and again, you know, the conversation about especially with Kevin, because I talked to him more, just because of the previous relationship I had with him. We put a maximum, I think it was 180 days. It was our maximum dates. WWE was at 50. But it's not half the, it wasn't half the dates. To me, it felt that way. Well, we had a maximum of 180 dates in there, and everybody did. Quite honestly, we never did it. We typically, at that time, we were coming in at probably average about 145 days. There's a lot of other work to them. Kevin was expecting his very first child, and then, you know, in WWE, he would have been on the, you know, with the number of days that they worked, and you put a, you know, a day of travel on the front end, and they rented from licensing, from merchandising, from pay-per-views, from house show revenue, and all the other ways that they got profit shares that you were at that time. But they had to work a lot harder to get it. And both of them expressed to me whether they were being honest or not about that. Both expressed to me, and especially with Kevin, with Kevin, because like I said, he was expecting to work. It was as much of a lifestyle consideration and a quality of life consideration as it was a financial consideration.
It's worth mentioning that a lot of the WCW payroll was being a racial discrimination lawsuit several years ago. And in 1996, according to this report,
Yes, those rumors were true.
$379,295. He was there for 31 weeks. Down to the old Japan schedule. That's $12,235.
I'm not giving up.
I'm curious, you mentioned it a few times there, so I gotta follow up. You didn't break that for more than what Flair was making. Was that some sort of edict from Turner, or you knew that Flair was having anyone best Flair?
I mean, one thing really clear right now,
More ammo for you!
any higher revenue or any choices that I simply had to stay within a budget. And Hulk Hogan was in the that required
Machine's seizing up.
everybody other than Hulk Hogan will be working in 94. That was something, as long as I was under the budget, money was simply a choice that I made, a decision I made.
Was a hard call.
I knew if I would have brought him in for more, I'd have more headaches than I already anticipated. I knew it was going to be a controversial move to bring those guys in. They had a reputation. You know, the locker room in WCW at that time, relatively speaking, was pretty stable.
Better than any Marshall.
What it had been in years
Better than
previous.
Chicago.
And I didn't want to bring two guys in from the WWE, especially Scott and Kevin, with the reputation they had.
Whatever you left uninitiated, I felt it ache.
But that changed
My
the
chest
next year, because the next
I was
year,
gone
Scott Hall
forever.
made almost $200,000 more than Rick. What changed?
I'm so sorry.
Don't go.
The company
You did a good thing for the
generating
village.
space on
You gave
the
a lonely old
NWA
soldier
label.
some songs.
So let me ask you
take
this.
this.
Scott and Kevin both say,
You deserve it.
in years past, of course,
You're young and strong and many victories in
offer,
it.
they would have stayed.
But perhaps
In that
someday
area,
you
did
could come
you
back.
ever think that you were
If you're
really
up for
just
another
being
hunt.
played
I just might
for
be.
negotiation leverage with the WWF by these two guys?
I never thought that, but I always questioned the forthrightness of anything that I heard. Like, talent's talent, especially back again, context is king. Back then, I knew that there was a good chance I was being worked or played, if you will. But for the most part, I took everything at face value. If it ended up I was getting worked, it did. Whatever. I didn't worry about it. I didn't, spend a lot of time trying to read between anybody's lines. I knew what my budget was. I knew what I wanted to do. If it worked for me, it'll work out. If it didn't work for me, it didn't. I don't know that that was true, honestly. I got the impression from Kevin, and again, the story I was told, by Kevin at that time, was that he found out, he had access to some recent payouts, and he was looking at what he was getting on these payouts and looking at what everybody else was getting on those payouts, and he didn't like it. And between that and the quality of life issue, he was just tired of it, and he wanted to leave. And I took it at face value. I didn't really worry about it too much.
Kevin has said that one of the turning points for him wanting to leave was creatively at the February '96 pay-per-view. There's a match here where Brett doesn't want to be powerbombed, and the office sides with Brett, and Nash walked over to Scott and said, "See if you can get me a deal," talking about WCW. And the creative is at least the narrative that Kevin pushes publicly as the primary reason for him wanting to leave. Did that ever come up, or was it always about, I think I'm getting fucked around on my money?
It never came up. Absolutely never came up. Not a syllable of that came up to me. It may have been true. I wasn't there. I don't know. I guess, maybe Kevin had that as a major issue and didn't feel the need to share it with me. As I just talked about, as far as everything that I can remember, he felt like he was getting screwed on his money. And more than that, and I believe this part, especially after, all the years of working with Kevin now, he doesn't like to travel. He doesn't like to be away from home. It was always a grind for him. And I really did believe, and still do to this day, that the primary reason he came to WCW was the fact that it was a lighter schedule.
Now, Bruce Pritchard says that Nash offered to tell the whole locker room that the rumors that were swirling of him leaving was bullshit, and he would address the rumors head-on with the boys. And when Vince asked him to follow through, Nash got cold feet and didn't do it. So on March the 5th, Kevin Nash gave notice to Vince McMahon by phone of his intent to join WCW. And Meltzer even reports that the call was made around 10:50 in the morning. Yeah, Eric, to nail down the time like this, somebody's clearly
Gotta
talking
grab its
to
data
Meltzer.
to reconnect with the
Any
dome
idea
back at
who
the
it may
base.
have been? Do you think Kevin was speaking to him?
Or Meltzer's clearly bullshit.
Okay.
Or I think probably the answer is somewhere in between. I think Kevin could have easily had that conversation with somebody. Somebody could have been in the room when he had that conversation. I don't know. And somebody else could have given that information to Meltzer. I don't know.
Maybe I can find something to jump onto the journey.
At that time. And there were a lot of people talking to Meltzer and feeding him information that they thought would benefit them in some way, shape, or form, politically or otherwise. So just because Meltzer reported it doesn't necessarily mean it was true, although he gets a lot of facts right. There's no doubt about it. It's got a lot of sources, no doubt about it. But I have no idea who it was speaking to. I doubt it was Kevin. I can't imagine Kevin picking up the phone calling Dave Meltzer. But who knows? He's been shocked before.
Meltzer reported that Nash was believed to have been offered a 3-year deal, escalating from $450 to $750, but Nash was telling everybody it was $780 grand. What number sounds right to you, Eric? Right.
Just without a doubt. I wouldn't have brought him in for more than we're talking about when he first came in. I'm not talking about when they got, what he's just going later on. But at that time, I would not have brought him in at Sting's level.
It's worth mentioning that Kevin Nash, according to these same court documents in 1996, made $336,261. The next year, he was bump up to $756, even more than Scott Hall. Let's get going here. Kevin, as Diesel, of course, lost to Undertaker at WrestleMania 12. The following month, he lost to Shawn Michaels at Good Friends, Better Enemies. Scott Hall lost to Vader on that same show, and it's their last pay-per-view for the WWF until 2002. And it almost feels like the stars sort of aligned for this NWO angle because all of a sudden, Scott and Kevin's contracts expired just 6 days apart. When did you realize that, and is that sort of the catalyst for you deciding, hey, what if we do a takeover, or how do those wheels come into motion for this NWO angle?
They were really, again, it's hard for me to create a timeline that took her 20 years ago especially as it relates to the NWA, but because the idea, the catalyst for the idea really started a year or more before it actually materialized. So, I'm going to give you
to jump onto that droid and get it there.
answers to some of this, and it's not because I'm trying to be evasive, and it's not because I don't remember, but to try to pin it down to the week or the month or how it coincided with the contract issue is really difficult for me to do. But the idea, when I knew Scott was coming in, probably a couple weeks before he was due to arrive is when, in my mind at least, from what I remember now, that's when the idea started to form in my head. Because I knew I wanted to do this reality-based game. I wanted to do a storyline where the audience wasn't quite sure if it was real or if it was scripted. Scott and Kevin both worked with WCW previously. Scott and Kevin both
I should grab the drones down and get it started.
should have been like we're treated like stars, we used them right, yada yada yada. We've heard it all before. They went to WWF. They became bigger stars or big stars in WWF. And storyline-wise, it became apparent to me that this was a perfect catalyst for a reality-based story. Two guys used to work here. They got pissed off. They left. They went over. They became big stars, and now they were coming back to the company they used to work for to get revenge. That was the premise of the NWO storyline. So the idea of the storyline, as it began to really materialize, started happening a couple weeks before, probably Scott and Kevin showing up.
So when you have those conversations, are you doing some sort of a conference call? Are you talking to them one at a time? Scott first, then Kevin. What do those conversations look like where you're sort of laying the groundwork of what the idea is?
I didn't lay it out to them before they got there. I definitely did not lay it out to them. Part of it is because I didn't trust anybody at the time to keep their mouth shut, because everybody was spilling information from inside. I had no idea who was talking, to guys like Meltzer, Wade Geller, and who wasn't. There were a lot of people, with my own company, or I shouldn't say a lot, but there were some people in my own company that I didn't really trust with certain types of information. And sometimes, look, it's not like, I want to make sure I make this really clear. I say things sometimes that I shouldn't say, not because I want to mislead somebody, not because I want to undermine somebody. In a fit of excitement, I may accidentally share information that, in retrospect, I shouldn't have shared. And this idea was so important to me that I didn't want to take that chance. Now, there were people there that I didn't trust. There were people there that I suspected. I never had hard, fast evidence that they were leaking information, or I would have fired them. But there were certain people that I suspected. So I kept this stuff to myself. I didn't really share the details of the storyline until it was absolutely necessary. Not with anybody. Not with the booking committee. Certainly not with Scott and Kevin prior to them getting there. I had very little conversation with Scott Hall until the day I picked him up at the airport Marriott in Atlanta and drove him to Macon, Georgia.
We'll get there. Well, let me ask this. When the booking committee knows that you have signed Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, well, I guess I should ask this. When did they know you signed Scott Hall and Kevin Nash?
Hell, I don't remember. Probably shortly after I signed them. I would assume I would have told them at that point. There would have been no reason to keep it secret because documents would have had to have been generated. People would have to know. It wasn't like I was trying to sneak them in the back door, for crying out loud. I just didn't want to share the details of the story, partly because I didn't want it to get out, and also because I didn't have all the pieces figured out in my head yet. I mean, I had a general idea of what I wanted to do, but I didn't have it. I didn't have the beats to the story. I just had the framework to the story.
Makes total sense to me. I guess my question is, what was the booking committee thinking they were coming in for? I mean, they've got to be, it's not just, well, they're showing up and we'll figure it out. They had some sort of ideas working on their end that you're going to kibosh. But chat me up. What did they think the storyline was going to look like?
I'm not sure. Honestly, it's, you're asking me, what did I think somebody else was thinking 20 years ago? I can't answer that. And that's not being evasive, that's just being real.
Okay, let's talk about what you do know. The conversations with these guys, did they have certain hot buttons and wanting to WWE? One of the things we hear a lot about is guys, of course, sometimes they ask for their hotels to be paid for one of the D's and for one first-class air. Another thing we've heard is guys wanted a later call time to TV. Any of those type of talking points, does that stuff come up with these guys at all?
It would have come up in their contracts, of course. Absolutely. The number of dates certainly became, again, that was one of the key sales points from my point of view. Scott and Kevin, the number of dates was a real issue. First class was a real issue. A lot of guys got first class. A lot of guys didn't. It was where you were in the car, just like it currently does in WWE. As far as showing up at the building on time or getting a later call time, this is the first I've heard of that.
Okay, better.
Talk about favorite nations. This is the clause that everybody's heard about in their contract, and I think you should probably explain what it is, and then explain whether or not they actually got this, and how the fuck they got it if they did.
Favorite nations is a clause in someone's agreement. For example, if I can do that, a clause in my agreement, it would essentially say, I'm covering your for $100 a day, and if you bring someone else in, they're being paid $120 a day, I am automatically raised to that level. No one can make more money than me. I have to be on par with everybody else. Down to certain nations. The nations who are not the cover. Until really came along, possibly even Bret Hart. It may have been Bret Hart who was the catalyst for that. Again, there's no way I can remember when we first used that clause. But it was at a time when we were bringing in a lot of talent, a lot of top talent, and we were writing big checks. More importantly, it was a time when guys like Henry Holmes and Barry Bloom and agents and managers began communicating with each other because they represented, for example, Henry Holmes not only represented Hulk Hogan, he represented Randy Savage, he represented Bill Goldberg. So all of a sudden, Henry knows and is using one to improve the other. It's not unusual. Very same thing. Only Barry Bloom was he was a little less transparent about it. Let's say that. So it became necessary when we started bringing in these guys, especially at that level. You start having to negotiate different types of agreements, and they did get. But I don't think it really started until either Bret Hart or possibly even Bill Goldberg's second contract.
There's a long-standing statement out there that I believe to be a myth, but a lot of wrestling fans have just, swallowed it, and it's become fact in the wrestling business. These guys were not the first two to get guaranteed contracts in professional wrestling, were they, Eric?
Well, no, I don't. It's amazing to me, and I get this all the time, and no matter how many times I talk about it, and no matter how many ways it is so obvious that it's not true, but people still want to believe it. Here are the facts. When Eric Bischoff came to work for WCW as a cleanup batter on the announce team, working for Jim Ross and Tony Schiavone, I came with a guaranteed freaking contract. The first day I showed up on the job, the very first day, I rode to the town with Dusty Rhodes and Doug Dillinger and Janie Angle, and we drove to Anderson, South Carolina, and I got to the building, and one of the first people that came up and said hi to me was Larry Zbyszko, because Larry and I worked together in AWA, and we're pretty good friends back then. One of the first things that Larry does is pull me off to the side and say, kid, keep your chin down. Don't stir up any shit, and you'll get paid for life. Because they all had guaranteed contracts before I freaking got there. So how this becomes Eric Bischoff started giving out guaranteed contracts, I'll never freaking know. I really won't. But it's out there. It's up to you, Conrad. It's up to you. You got to tell the truth here.
Well, listen, I'm with you on this one. I'm going to call bullshit on a lot of your other silly nonsense, but I'm with you on this one. The Midnight Express had guaranteed contracts like forever prior to this, so I mean that even predates you there. So it's all silly nonsense. Now, let me ask this though about those contracts. In this era, are guys like Scott Hall and Kevin Nash asking for and receiving some sort of signing bonus of any sort?
No. No. If anybody out there wants to show me a contract that proves I'm a liar or that I'm wrong or that somehow my information isn't right, I'll be happy to put ketchup on it and eat the prick. But you know what? Nobody asked for a signing bonus. Not that. No. It wasn't common. I'm really, really trying to rack my brain here to see if there was any situation that could even be construed as something that felt like a signing bonus. A guarantee or an advance against a licensing guarantee or something like that, which could be construed to be a signing bonus, but I can't think of one.
Kevin said that you came to his house in Phoenix, and that's where you pitched the NWO angle. What do you remember about that trip?
I did go to Phoenix to meet with Kevin because I wanted to try to get a feel for him and just get on, I guess, the same page with him creatively and see where his head was at. I didn't pitch the entire angle. I let it out in pieces as I needed to. Again, partly because I wanted to keep it to myself, partly because it wasn't 100% clear to me who the third man was going to be and how it was going to play out. Like I said, I had the general architecture of the idea down, but I didn't have the details and the beats. But I did go to Phoenix. I remember it was hot as hell. And I think we ended up at a strip club, if I'm not mistaken. And I think I spent the night at his house, wherever the hell he lived at the time. But yeah, no, it's true. I did go.
Did you have any takeout?
Not that I recall.
Okay. Keller reported in April that an early idea for Nash when he came in was possibly some sort of play off of Nash's old character from years earlier, Vinny Vegas. This is hilarious.
Going to bed?
Response all these years later.
Remember to wake me up at 7:30 if I'm not up.
It's just so effing stupid.
Well, if you get up and I'm still asleep, wake me up.
I mean, first of all,
I'll set my alarm, but just in case.
Honestly, I'm in shock that he would be dumb enough to write something like that. Who would, number one, who would believe it?
Right.
Number two, why would anybody do it or think about doing it? And number three, why would Kevin Nash go from being Diesel to go back to being Oz again? This is so stupid, but whatever. Hey, you gotta print something, right?
Around this same time, you did interviews with Mike Mooneyham and the Miami Herald, and you told both that you had no deal with Kevin Nash and that he had a big mouth and sometimes isn't afraid to speak before he thinks. Meltzer knew better, though, and wrote, quote, Bischoff seems to be working some sort of storyline of his own. I guess technically you could probably argue that you just had a letter of intent or a deal memo here, and you weren't technically lying. Is that right?
No, I was technically lying. I was protecting the idea. I didn't know those guys anything.
No,
business is a work.
Absolutely.
And it's just, it's not like I'm a freaking politician. By the way, I'm not going to talk politics, but it's not like I'm a politician. I'm not a judge. This isn't a murder trial I'm involved with here. It's professional wrestling, for crying out loud. Yeah, I lied to him. I used the media to advance a story. Imagine that.
May 8th, WCW announces that Nitro is going to be expanding from 1 hour to 2 hours, effective on May 27th. Now, according to the legend, that was supposed to happen anyway in August or September, but Meltzer's sort of freestyling that it's being moved up here in response to the ratings that came out 2 days prior, where Nitro did a 1.9 at 7 p.m., but Raw did a 4.1 at 9 p.m. Were the plans hurried along to expand Nitro in response to the ratings, or was this based on you knowing that Scott Hall was coming in that day?
It wasn't based on me knowing that Scott Hall was coming in that day. That would have been a programming just look. I had a lot to do with a lot of things. My fingerprints were all over a lot of things. But scheduling Nitro and programming the network was not one of them. That was a decision that was made at the network level for whatever reasons they made them. I certainly went along with it. We had planned for it, prepared for it. But it wasn't me sitting in a room going, Scott Hall's coming in. I'm going to pick up the phone. Hey, Brad Siegel, I know you probably had a movie planned, and I know you had advertising sold for said movie, and I know you had all kinds of other things going on, but I've changed my mind, and I want us to go, an extra hour now because I've got a hunch. It wasn't that, I can assure you.
Was anyone nervous about expanding the 2 hours? Briefly tell us the commitment per hour required.
I don't know, nervous isn't the right word, I guess. It's hard. Even back then, it's a lot harder now. It's hard to hold an audience's attention for 2 hours a week. It's different if you're doing it once a month or a quarterly special like the Clash of the Champions was, things like that. It was stressful to a degree. We did a lot of experience to it. Clash of the Champions and things like that. But to write it off every week
The ratings for the Monday Night War in May 6th. On May 6th, Raw did a 4.1, Nitro did a 1.9. That brings us to discover. May 13th, we have Raw at a 3.5, Nitro is at a 2.3. Check this out on May 20th, Raw is at a 2.3, and Nitro is at a 3.1. Today we're here to talk about that. May 27th, Raw does a 2.3, and Nitro does a 2.8. Let's talk about May 19th right now, though. That's the Slamboree pay-per-view going down in Baton Rouge. It's the same night that the WWF is running Madison Square Garden. It's Scott Hall and Kevin Nash's last night, so of course this is the famous, or maybe infamous, curtain call, where Hunter, Sean, Scott, and Kevin all break kayfabe and hug in the ring at the end of the show. And it really was what everybody was talking about. When did you first hear about the curtain call? And did Hall and or Nash call you that night or communicate anything about this? Because it was clearly what everyone was talking about the following week.
I probably found out about it the following week. Indirectly. I didn't hear from Scott and Kevin. Oh, guess what we just did? Oh, you're gonna love this, or you're gonna hate this, or whatever. I didn't hear from them directly, but I heard everybody else, through the grapevine, that
There we go, trench.
bother me one way or the other.
So between May 19th, the night of the curtain call, and May 26th, the night before Scott Hall debuts on Nitro, what was your conversation like with him during that week? Scott Hall, so last night is May 19th, and the day before Nitro is May 26th. So we've got a 7-day week here before he's coming in to make Nitro. What were you talking about that week with Scott Hall? At this point, you're smarting him up on the ankle. You're not laying it out.
No, and I think I picked him up May 27th, and I remember that only because it was my birthday.
Okay.
Particularly the Nitro. No, I don't think I had any conversations with them. If I did, they were superfluous to or didn't mean much. I can guarantee you that. Scott, I was very impressed. Yeah, I'm not sure why. Other than the fact that I felt like it worked really well, or at least I didn't have that same feeling. Scott's reputation was a little gambling. We knew he had some issues, and we talked a little bit about that. So I didn't share anything with him. Let's just
Talk about it like it is. Scott has had some substance issues. So do you have a conversation with him like that before you ever even have him sign a contract and say, hey man, I need you to keep it between the lanes, or what does that sound like?
Yeah, they probably did. He was getting his life under He wanted to be a good corporate citizen. Again, you'll get a lot of guys who disagree with me on this or call bullshit on this. Context is king. At that time, the locker room, when I, for example, and even got control. And the locker room as things were starting to change, momentum. Now, a lot of people, not just a lot of other things that were changing the locker room was really good. And I was so that bringing Scott Hall and Kevin to a degree, and a combination of them for sure, upset the apple cart and cause a big issue for them. I was more concerned with Scott than I was with Kevin. And because I did have a conversation with him, Scott, as I said, that I was sure by him. He wanted to come in and be a good corporate citizen in an area. I wanted to spend some time with him. And my opinion was see if he was bullshitting me or if he was straight.
Let me ask this. When you're telling him, we're going to have you come into Atlanta, I'm going to give you the hotel, blah, blah, blah. You tell him, like, hey, don't bother bringing gear? Did he have non-razor gear? Or did you just say, hey, you're just going to do a promo, so bring some shit that was on TV, just street clothes? Or is that...
No, we knew he wasn't going to wrestle. We knew we were bringing him in. I knew I was bringing him in to kind of crash the party. By that time, at least for that week, I had the beats figured out in my head. And probably the beats for the next couple of weeks out in my head. So he wasn't going to wrestle a match, and I knew that. It was just bring your gear. Not your gear, I'm sorry.
Okay. So, I don't know. I've always sort of found it fun that he doesn't know he's about to make major history until you pick him up from the airport. You were just like, May 27th, man. I don't think the business will be the same. I think you really could go back and circle it. There's one other day we're going to talk about in a minute. But let's talk about the plan that night. You wrote in your book that the plan was for him to, quote, walk down from the audience, grab a microphone, create a disturbance, and sound off. He was arrested, pissed off, coming back to WCW with a chip on his shoulder. The chip was that he had been disrespected at WCW. The company had held both him and Kevin back, and now they wanted revenge. They were the outsiders. They had reached a level of stardom in WWE and decided to come back because they'd been disrespected. Did you decide to call them the outsiders, or did that name just come about later?
Spontaneous, because we didn't know what else to call them. I didn't want to give them a gimmick name. That was the whole idea. When I found out I was going to have to do Nitro, because it was not something I asked to do, wanted to do, or expected I was going to do, it was kind of thrust in my lap.
Parts I need. I should check all them
I know we're
shirts.
backing up here a little bit, but it's an important answer to this question. I didn't want to do everything the same. I wanted to be as different as I could possibly be from the WWE. I wanted a reality-based storyline. I wanted my characters to feel real. I wanted to blur the lines between scripted, typical wrestling presentation and reality, so I could keep the audience a little bit off balance. So we didn't have a name for them. We didn't know what to call them. And I think it could have been just spontaneous. And that's probably how it started, to be honest with you.
Let's talk about Scott Hall coming through the crowd that night. He has said that this is actually Larry Zbyszko's idea, because if he came down the aisle from the back, it sort of kills the invasion aspect before it even gets started. But having him come through the crowd makes it look like he really is from the outside, or maybe that the WWF sent him here. Set the record straight, Eric. Did you have Scott coming in from the back, or was this the original idea to always come down from the crowd?
I'm going to answer the question, but I want to preface this with, I always give credit, I try as best I can to remember where an idea started. And it's really difficult because when we talk about certain ideas that we all remember, this being one of them, it's very easy to remember the moment. It's very easy for me to go, well, wait a minute, I had the whole story kind of laid out in my head, at least for a couple of weeks. I knew what I wanted. I had a lot of the details that nobody else had. So it would be easy for me to say, I am 100% sure that was my idea. But I'm going to tell you that I could be wrong. It could have been an hour before showtime. By that time, everybody knows now. By that time, you know, I have to tell my director, I have to tell the producers, I have to tell the referees. I have to share what we're about to do. With enough people, it is possible that Larry came in and said, why don't we do this instead? There is a chance that that happened, but I don't think so.
The promo itself, of course, is huge. He's sort of teasing that he's going to be back with his big friend, and you're really patting yourself on the back in your promo here. Well, maybe not in your promo, but it feels like your book is a promo at times. Who's coming with him? What did they do? How? What would the consequences be? What were their agenda?
You've clearly never written them. You've never written a script. You've never created anything, and that's not enough. But that's part of the process. And I shared that in my book, quite frankly, so people could help understand the difference between the way we were trying to tell stories then and the way Isaac Yankem was telling stories in the WWF, or Doink the Clown. So yeah, there was a difference, and I think it was important to share that while you're knocking it. By the way, have you ever written a book?
No, I'd love to hear about your Scott Baio series, though. What channel can we find that shit on?
Which one? We did two seasons on VH1 and 61 episodes on Nickelodeon. Take a pick.
Just busting your balls, kind sir. I'm sure everybody is excited that Scott Baio's 40 and single, or whatever it is.
You can pick on Scott Baio all you want, but at least the Nickelodeon series was a big money maker.
Yeah. Well, Charles ain't in charge of much these days, though. Here's Meltzer's breakdown of what happened. A combination of bad matches, bad commentary, little hyper-excitement, bad interviews, and bad angles resulted in a 2-hour broadcast reminiscent more of a bad WCW Saturday Night show as opposed to the competing Monday Night Raw. However, amidst the attempt at a cure for insomnia was the debut of Scott Hall, done in a manner that is almost certain to be one of the biggest money angles of the year. So he really puts it over huge, and he says, from a one-upsmanship category, it was the biggest strike Bischoff has pulled off, including the Lex Luger debut, in that he's using McMahon's own storyline parody angles that were supposed to be used against WCW and ended up being used in WCW's biggest angle against the WWF as a way to draw money, doing a Japanese-style fake shoot angle built around a promotional war. It was retribution for McMahon attempting to make a fool of Bischoff on his Raw show by putting one of his letters regarding the parodies on television and having Doc Hendricks saying that this same executive from Turner Broadcasting, without ever mentioning Bischoff by name, who had days earlier called to say how much he enjoyed the parodies. So Meltzer loves it, says the rest of Nitro sucked, which I guess in hindsight is sort of hard to argue. But you had to be feeling like this was a stake through the heart of Vince McMahon when this angle's done that night. Do you not? I mean, when he comes back through the curtain, you guys know you've got something here. Do you not?
Had a pretty good sense of it. You know, I wasn't overconfident with it at the time, but it, you know, the crowd reaction was good. It kind of checked all the boxes I was hoping to achieve in terms of making it feel real, doing something that was completely different, creating a question, yes, creating a mystery, forcing the audience to ask themselves what the hell is going to happen next. I mean, that's what you're supposed to do when you produce television, right? You're supposed to keep people tuning in from week to week to week to want to see where it's going to go and what's going to happen next. And I knew that we checked all those boxes. But, you know, again, I didn't feel like I drove a stake through anybody's heart. I didn't feel like, wow, I really showed Doc Hendricks and Vince McMahon. You know, I really one-upped him. I didn't feel any of those things. I was excited because I felt like it worked. I got a good feeling about the promo that he cut, but that was about it.
Of course, the show goes off the air, and it's pretty phenomenal. He's face-to-face with you, calling you a Ken doll, telling you to shut your mouth and that we're sick of it. And you press him on who is we. He says you know who. He references the billionaire Ted and Nacho Man that we mentioned. And then he has the famous lines, you want to go to war. And he says we're taking over, and the show goes off the air. I've always been curious because Tony Schiavone has said at times he didn't get much direction one way or another, and he just had to play it like a shoot. What did Tony and Larry know, and what were they coached to say? And this is, I guess it's worth mentioning, you and Bobby did the rest of the show, but Tony and Larry start the first, I don't know, hour or so of the show. And this is the first time you guys did that. Concern as to these guys can help get it over and those can't, and that's the reason we rotated. We just wanted to give them an hour break since we had a 2-hour show and feature more talent. What were the announcers instructed to sort of put over that night?
Well, again, you asked me two different questions. Why did we have, an announcer transition or shift? And what did Larry and Tony know? The reason that we had two sets of announcers in a 2-hour show is because I was of the mind at that time that the audience, no matter how good an announcer is, listening to the same two guys talking and selling and filling in the blanks for 2 hours could get a little tiresome, even the good ones. So my logic was, let's have one team do 1 hour and another team do another hour. In terms of what Tony and Larry knew, not a lot, and that has nothing to do with trusting them or not trusting them. When I came up in the wrestling business with Vern Gagne, who really, he and Greg are the ones that really taught me, I guess, psychology and from at least their perspective, what a wrestling product should look like and feel like to the audience. And it was pounded into my head over and over and over again by Vern Gagne that you don't need to know what the finishes are in every match. You should, if you're doing play-by-play, you should treat it like you're the fan. You're the fan with the best seat in the house, and you should be reacting to what you're seeing, not predicting what you're about to see. And a lot of talent has that challenge. Not a lot of play-by-play guys at that time were comfortable because it's just not the way they would know. They were trained. They were trained to know what the finish is going to be, and who's going to do next to who, and what's going to happen next week. And they were given so much information that they would inadvertently sometimes foreshadow it. And I believe firmly that when you shoot a hot angle, it's better for if it's a good announcer like Tony was and is, and Larry, because I knew Larry, I had worked with him in the AWA, they're smart enough to know how to treat it. I know I was. And I preferred that my announcers didn't know too much, because if they did, they weren't reacting naturally, and that's what I was hoping for.
Let's talk about the end of the show, because I'm curious, of course the long-standing thing with a lot of the guys in the back is everything's a work, everything's an angle. How many of the guys in the back were sort of not sure? I know that sounds silly, but I mean, years later, people were still saying, oh, Vince McMahon sent him down here to poison WCW. I don't know how that silly shit gets stirred up, but somebody in the back had to be getting pretty lathered up about this. Any funny stories you can share with us?
I don't really have any funny stories, to share. I can give you the general tone and tenor that I remember. There were a lot of people that were off-put by it. Part of it was a combination of things. Part of it was the reputation that Scott had, on that night. Here we are bringing this guy in. They see him coming in through the crowd, interrupting a match in the middle of a match, which had never been done before that I can recall. Shooting that promo, getting the kind of heat that he got. What do you think a lot of guys in the back are thinking? Oh my God, this is working. That's not good for me. That's kind of the general, it's not uncommon for that, especially at that time. Again, context is king. At that time, everybody's fighting for their spot. Everybody wants to be featured. Everybody's hoping to be a main event. No matter where you are on the card, that's your goal, and it should be. But to have a guy come in from the outside, even though Scott started in WCW, or at least was there for a long time, it still felt like, oh great, another WWE guy coming in and getting the spotlight. So there was some of that. And there was some, honest, like, what the hell was that? What are they doing? So there were people that were nervous about it, no doubt about it.
Looking back, is there anything you do differently that night?
I would try harder to entertain the announcer. For the show. But other than making Dave happy, I don't
say. He's sort of influenced, and maybe he was a shit disturber before, but now that he's here with a reputation, did he go out of his way to try to endear himself with some of the guys and try to make nice, or was he sort of off to the side by himself, or what do you recall?
You know, he was sociable. I mean, Scott knew a lot of the guys. You know, there was a lot of people that were there. You know, when Scott it was in WCW the first time. You know, he knew a lot of the crew. So there was, you know, there was a number of people that, some people that had, you know, worked, I guess, you know, for a little bit in WWF. So he was sociable. He was very, he was on a ride from, you know, from Atlanta down to Macon. He was humble. He understood that he had a challenge ahead of him. You know, he had a reputation to overcome. He seemed really focused and prepared to do just that. He got to the building. He was polite. He introduced himself to a lot of people. Certainly, you know, like I said, some of them he knew better than others. I don't think he could have been on better behavior that night, quite honestly. I worked on his promo. I literally wrote his promo for him on Jenny Engel's computer, probably an hour or so before the show. And he was there, kind of adding to it, you know, suggesting a couple things as we wrote. We rehearsed it a couple times. He went out and did his business. And,
there's been reports of rebel movements all over the jungle. A few set up camp just west of
The Road Warriors quit the very
whole
next day
squad's
on the
hiding out in the
28th.
south.
You remember what
They've
happened?
even managed to take over an area southwest of here.
They, you know, they had been working back and forth with
Those
Japan,
traitors don't know when to
Japan
give
Wrestling.
And our squads are at
There's
that.
no politics.
We could really use the help of a proven champion.
It wasn't about any of that.
I'll see what I can do.
It was just kind of coincidental. They decided they wanted to go back to work for Japan. There's a lot of things going on in the business at that time. And for whatever reason, they decided they wanted to go.
The next week on Raw, Vince would go out of his way to say that Diesel and Razor Ramon are no longer part of the World Wrestling Federation, but that they intend to portray themselves as those stars they once were, and they're a part of a ruse, that they're still a part of the WWF, when they're actually under contract to a rival wrestling organization. And he encouraged fans to call the hotline or to check out America Online for more details. When you see this, or you hear it, I guess I should ask, were you watching Raw on the monitor in the back at this time, or does somebody give you the heads up during the show, or do you just see it later on tape?
No, I find out about it the next day. You know, to bust another urban legend, I never watched the monitor. First of all, I was doing play-by-play half the time, or I was in the ring the other half of the time, or preparing to, or working on other creative backstage. I wasn't sitting and watching the monitor, so calling bullshit on that one. I didn't find out about it until, I don't know, probably the next day when I got back, I heard about it.
So when you hear about it, I mean, you got to know, hey, we fucking struck a nerve. And one of the things that I've always heard in wrestling is, if it's over with the boys, then it's over. And when you see that Vince is sort of selling it, I mean, if he does sells it, then maybe, you know, it's not a big deal. But when he's really selling it on his show, it really plays to your favor, does it not?
Selling like a bitch. Yeah, of course it does. Again, all kidding aside, it didn't matter to me. You know, at that point, you know, probably should have in retrospect. But to me, it didn't matter. I knew we were doing. By that time, you could feel the momentum. I mean, you would have to be, you know, you'd have to be a corpse not to feel the momentum and feel the energy and feel the crowd reaction and see the potential. So I wasn't overwhelmed or underwhelmed by anything that WWE was saying or doing at the time. Quite honestly, I wasn't paying close attention. You know, I'd hear about things that people felt I should know about. I was being made aware of things, but I just didn't really care.
So let's talk about the legal letter that the WWF sends Scott Hall that they actually publish on America Online. They even put out the message, in an effort to further blur the lines between Ted Turner's wrestling organization and the World Wrestling Federation, Scott Hall, portraying the World Wrestling Federation character Razor Ramon, recently appeared on World Championship Wrestling television programming, and then they published the actual letter. And allegedly in this letter, they say they're going to be withholding all future payments for like merchandise checks, the pay-per-view payoff, and whatever else was owed to him until it was settled. and they're saying that this was deliberate infringement of Titan's intellectual property in connection with his appearance on Nitro. And they're saying that his appearance and various statements made by him sort of express the idea that he works for Titan, and he doesn't, and that he's staying in the Razor Ramon character, which is something they've registered. They say that he dresses like Razor, that he utilized a Hispanic accent given to him by Titan as part of that character, and you guys are off to the races. When he gets this letter, does he bring it to you, or, I mean, how do you hear about, you know, him sort of being up against Titan legally here?
Fingers feel
I'm not
stiff
sure
in
if he
this
brought it
cold.
to me or if he brought it to Nick Lambros, who was our attorney. He probably would have made me aware of it, but it would have either through me or directly to Nick Lambros in our legal department. But yeah, I was aware of it. I just didn't know whether it came to me first or it went to Nick Lambros first.
So, is this when you guys decide, hey, we gotta go with the real names? I know you wanted sort of the real edge anyway, but according to the rumor and innuendo, you guys hadn't really settled on a name, and that's the reason you don't name them right away. Were other names ever discussed, or did you always know I wanted them to use their real name?
No, I knew I wanted them to use their real name. We had considered, even though I knew what I wanted to do, we left the door open. If something else made sense, but I wanted them to be Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, just like I wanted Bill Goldberg to be Bill Goldberg. Just I wanted a lot of guys to be their own real characters, or extensions of their real characters using their real names. That was it.
Let's talk about, you know, the use of real names. At this time, it really wasn't done that much. I know that sounds silly now, but back then, it was pretty revolutionary. Not a lot of guys were using their real name. Scott and Kevin sort of came up in a different era. Were they cool with using their real name?
Yeah. Absolutely have no fucking idea. I think we had any reservations in this recipe, but it never came up.
On the June 3rd night, though, Scott here at the end of the show, it almost feels like he's loosening up on the accent a little bit. As best you can tell.
Probably. By that time, you know, once you start getting into letters, you know, you've got to lose nothing. You've got your back, or I have on my back, and started to suggest that was a direct result of us probably getting a phone call from a lawyer, Turner Broadcasting.
Sting and Hall get into it on that show, and Doug did a part, and Hall announced that they have a big surprise next week. What was your conversation like with Hall? Because obviously he's going to be making a debut on Nitro.
Lightning,
Are you
what's
going to
the
be once a week, every couple of days? What's it like on Kevin this week before the day?
Conversation. That was something that I could recall us talking about. Again, the way we worked, which is not uncommon. Even today in WWE, when I was there, you didn't find out what you were doing on any given day. Until the day you got there, it must be something very unusual or specific. And it was no different back then.
June 10th. You guys drew 3,500 folks here for 41,000, but man, houses are about to take up. It's the go-home show for the Great American Backstage Review, and at the end of the show, Scott Hall comes out again. Conversation. Kevin Nash walks up behind you. Something like, you've been out here for 6 months running your mouth. This is what it's going to say, huh? Look at the adjective. We ain't here to play. Now, he said last week that he was going to bring somebody out here. I'm here. You still don't have your 3 people. You know why? Because nobody wants to face us. So we're really adding some realism here. But unfortunately, that's not what a lot of wrestling fans talk about. People love to give shit to Nash for the phrase, look at the adjective. Let's talk about the scripting here of the promo. What was it like in this time frame of WCW? Is it bullet points, or is it the extensive level of scripting that we see now in the WWE?
No, it wasn't anything close. It would have been bullet points, and it would have been, an hour before we go out, let's go over it one more time if we need to. But no, it would not have been the extensive scripting that we're seeing now. We never did that. Thank God. So no, Kevin and I went over it. We knew what we wanted. More than anything, what we talked about is not, well, when you say this, I'm going to say this, and when you reach up, scratch your ear, I'm going to reach for the pencil, and then you say, don't grab that pencil, bitch. It was never anything like that. We knew what we wanted to accomplish. We knew where we were going the following week. We knew what we wanted to happen the following week. So it was kind of like bullet points. Let's make sure we finish off strong. So we're selling what's going to happen next week. We're getting people to tune in to see what's going to happen next week.
You invite the guys to the pay-per-view. Of course, they accept, and then Nash shoves the mic in your chest, pose for the crowd. They go off the air. What's the reaction backstage to Nash's debut? Was everybody pleased with the way this comes together?
Yeah, they were. I think that one of the things I remember, either at that event or in the ones leading up to it or just after it, is these guys were, they were getting, they were coming in as heels, but they were getting cheered, and that was probably one of the things that made the locker room more nervous than anything. Because how do you're being booked as a babyface, but you're working with people that are getting popped. It makes working, in the ring a very challenging thing to do for a lot of people, and understandably so. But I think the reaction by that time it was pretty apparent that this thing is taken off. The momentum was clear to everybody at that point, so nobody really bitched about it, at least not to me, but it was pretty obvious.
This takes us to the Great American Bash, and up to this point, the guys are nameless, but they still come out to a big babyface pop. And then you guys go out of your way to say they do not work with the WWF, and they accept your challenge for Bash at the Beach, and then Hall punches you in the stomach, and Nash power bombs you through a table. Eric, is this your first bump? Whose idea was it? Did you walk through it that day? What can you tell us about this?
I think it was my first bump. And it was my idea. And no, we didn't walk through it. I'm kind of superstitious about rehearsing things like that. Physical issues, especially ones that are scary or dangerous, I should say. I figured if I was going to get hurt, I'd rather get hurt on a live pay-per-view and have it make some sense and be worth something, as opposed to getting hurt in a rehearsal and have to rewrite it. So I didn't rehearse it. I was pretty confident that I could pull it off. I had Kevin kind of walk me through my end of what I needed to do to get into that power bomb position for him. We rehearsed that a couple of times, maybe right before we went out, before the show. But other than that, no, it was improv.
Meltzer said the crowd popped, and the other half was shocked. At this point, it had never really been acknowledged on TV that you were running things. Are you happy with the way it was pulled off, and what was the reaction amongst the boys when they see the boss taking a power bomb through a fucking table?
Take much damage from the fire.
How people, the boys, put it, how they really felt and what they expressed to me were, by this time, usually two different things. I know how I felt. I was elated. I knew it was a big damn deal. And again, because it had never been done before. Not that I was the boss, but even as an announcer, typically announcers, they may have been grabbed a little bit, or they may have been pushed up against a table. Maybe somebody even slapped one once. I don't know. I'm not a wrestling historian. But nobody ever picked one up and power bombed them on the stage before. Pretty sure that never happened before. So again, it checked the box. Be as different as we can be from everything that's ever been done before, and I knew it. As soon as I got up and I got carried back, to the locker room, and I was still in place. I can move my fingers. It's good, but I could feel the reaction of the crowd. It was pretty intense.
to agree to give up being an active performer after his current program finishes to keep his booking job. Of course, after this week, he's the company hero. What really happened here? We haven't really heard you talk about Kevin Sullivan much. I'm curious, what caused you to leave the workhouse? Why did you give him the edict he had to stop wrestling? And how did he turn things around, at least in your mind?
Back then, and you could figure out for yourself why that would be. They were pretty flat out horrible. And then there was the conflict, the inherent conflict of the booker also being a talent, which had been an issue previously. It was an issue with Ric Flair. It was a very difficult thing for Ric to be the booker and also be, especially at Ric's level in the main event, as regularly as it was. And I didn't want that. I figured that out by then, that it was just not going to be healthy. If there was anything else kind of extemporaneous to that, I don't recall.
Hypothetically, do you think if Kevin Sullivan would have kept wrestling that he would have beat Goldberg at Starrcade 98?
If he would have stayed the booker, he would have.
I mean, that's the way it went down. So after this, Titan was sending letters to both Hall and Nash to the point that Hall hooked up with Hogan's attorney, Henry Holmes, to defend him in this Razor Ramon mannerism case. And his argument really is accurate, in my opinion. But a lot of that stuff really started with the Diamond Stud character, and he wants Henry to go help him collect the money that's owed to him by Titan. And eventually a lawsuit is filed by Titan Sports on June 20th, and they're asking for a restraining order against both Turner Broadcasting, WCW, and Eric Bischoff. And the lawsuit essentially had 4 counts. The first was unfair competition, claiming WCW had used false and misleading descriptions of fact that likely were to cause confusion in the marketplace and deceive consumers that Titan was somehow affiliated with this angle. The second count was trademark and trade distress infringement and false designation or origin regarding WCW using the trade and dress persona of Razor Ramon, which was a Titan trademark. The third count was Connecticut unfair competition and constant disparagement of Titan Sports on television and on its hotlines as either an unfair or deceptive act. And the final count was defamation and libel, stemming from the February 5th show, way before these guys were here, when the lights went out at a live Nitro in Lakeland, Florida. You and Steve McMichael were making comments sort of insinuating that maybe the competition had something to do with the power going out, but you apologized the following week. Now the silliness here is, Titan wants TBS and WCW to fork over all the profits from the June and July pay-per-views and then pay triple those profits as damages plus their attorney's fees. I know you sort of said earlier they kept you away from this, but when did you first hear about the lawsuit? What was your reaction?
Okay.
What was WCW's reaction?
It really wasn't so much WCW's reaction as it was Turner Broadcasting's reaction, because at this point, and again, it's important, I think, that people need to understand a couple things. Nick Lambros was an attorney who worked in my office and handled all things legal. He negotiated the details of the contracts. He would handle lawsuit issues. He really reported to the legal department of Turner Broadcasting. He had a dotted line to me, and I know you know what that means. But to our listeners, if you looked at the WWE flow chart, the WCW organizational chart, or flow chart as it's sometimes called, you would have had me at the very top as a president of the division, and you would have had different people underneath me, senior VPs, executive VPs, that type of thing. And then on that next level, on that senior VP, executive VP level, you would have had Nick Lambros, who was probably vice president of legal affairs. The line between myself and Nick Lambros was a dotted line. It was not a direct line, meaning Nick Lambros didn't work for me. I couldn't influence Nick. I couldn't tell him what to do. I couldn't fire him. I couldn't tell him who he could hire, who he couldn't fire. All of that was between him and the legal division of Turner Broadcasting. So once that WWF lawsuit came down, it didn't land on Nick Lambros' desk. It landed on Turner Broadcasting's desk in their legal department. and then it got down to Nick, and then it came to me. So I wasn't reacting to the letter as much as I was reacting to Turner Legal, and they took it very seriously. They knew that they knew it was going to cost them money. So of course they got very, very interested in it, and I had to react accordingly.
WCW's attorney David Dunn squared off against the WWF's attorney Jerry McDivitt in a Connecticut court for 2 hours on June 24th. Eventually, Judge Dorsey said he didn't have time to dedicate to this because he was in the middle of a major organized drug crime case, so it was delayed until the second week of July, which means it's after Bash at the Beach. The WWF is not happy with this and plan to pursue other options to stop it, but in this same 2-hour span, WCW's attorney Dunn brings up that 41 other wrestlers had jumped ship in the most recent few years, and 28 of them basically used the same name and persona. And then all mannerisms were actually in place in WCW first under his original Diamond Stud character. Since it is Kenny Vegas and Diamond Stud were joining WCW, the WWF had no issue. Eventually, the judge asked Dunn to have WCW play down the Ramon character, and WCW's attorney agrees, provided that the WWF will not sue based on the July 7th pay-per-view. Of course, McDivitt doesn't go for that. And he also said if he had Eric Bischoff on the stand, he just needed to ask him 10 questions to prove his case. But hear that, like you getting updates to report, things go as you expected. What can you tell us about this court date?
I'll give you a general update.
Where the quality of programming, creativity, star development, and consumer reflect success. However, when a giant competitor uses your very own creation to confuse the public, then the playing field isn't level and you're forced to fight in a different arena. Did you see the statement? What was your reaction?
There.
Better loot all the machine parties is here.
Tell that to Bourbon Gagne. Tell that to
Jim Crockett.
Jim Crockett. Tell that to Jerry Fair. Tell that to every promoter that Vince McMahon put out of business. You know, with the way he did business and stealing talent, raiding territories, locking them from buildings. These poor little old mom and pop promoters put out of business by this multi-generational behemoth called the WWF. 3 generations old. My God, my grandfather started this company. Yeah, I felt really bad about that. And you can tell to this day I'm still carrying much of that over with me. But I thought it was, look, kidding aside, I wish we would have had, attorneys that were willing to fight and were smart and determined and passionate about that fight, as Jerry McDivitt and his team was. It was a bullshit lawsuit, in my opinion, for a lot of reasons. I understand why he did it, because he had no choice, because we were stopping him, and he felt like that was the only thing he could do, and he was desperate, and he won. So good for him. But I didn't agree then, and I, to this day, don't agree with the basis for the suit. But it doesn't really matter. Suits are not often won, or not always won, by who's right or who's wrong. It's who's willing to stick out to fight the law.
Meltzer would write, WCW officials claim that they are researching trademarks for current planned new ring names for Hall and Nash. If the name's clear, they'll be given those names as soon as possible. If not, on the July 7th pay-per-view, they'll be referred to by the announcers as Kevin Nash and Scott Hall. I think you said a moment ago you always wanted them to use their real name to give it an air of realism. But this lawsuit sort of cements that that's the direction you need to go and really supports that idea, does it not?
It does, but I don't know how accurate that element of the lawsuit was. I don't think there was a lot of conversation between myself and the legal department when it came to, I certainly didn't talk to them about what I was thinking and what I wanted to do back in May at that point, because it wasn't the issue, or at least not to the extent that it is at this point. I can't put myself in David Dunn's mind and why he wrote what he wrote or took the position he took, but he did.
Let's talk a little bit about the lawsuit, because one of the things I saw in my research is that they're really debating things that were said on the hotline, which was hilarious to me. But it comes up a lot in court, to the point that allegedly legal required Mark Madden to start submitting his scripts before it was his day on the hotline 3 days ahead of time, so they had a chance to approve it. Do you remember there being some fallout for the WCW hotline, as silly as that is?
Where did that come from? Just out of curiosity.
It's got to be Meltzer or Killer.
Yeah. First of all, legal wouldn't, legal may, and again, this is trying to...
22 years later, yeah.
No, it's not even 22 years later. I'm now trying to add credibility to a Dave Meltzer or Wade Keller report, which we've already discovered in this podcast. Some of it was just nonsense and bullshit. So if they wrote it, and if there was a kernel of truth in that, here's what I suspect. Mark Madden was hard to manage. Mark Madden often went into business for himself. I will readily admit that there were things that Mark Madden said on that hotline that caused any number of issues, some big, some small. So it's not inconceivable to me that there's some truth to that report. I don't think anybody would have requested a script, but certainly they might want to be well aware of what kind of topics are going to be covered and how.
Let's talk a little bit about the lawsuit again, and then we'll put a bow on it for now. Is it true this fucking thing went on for 4 years and wasn't until 2000 when it was finally settled?
I don't know. Again, I wasn't involved in the details of the suit, other than, when I had to be deposed, or when in the process of discovery I had to turn over my records, or whatever I had to do as my part in that. So I can't tell you how long it went on and how it was settled and what the settlement was, because I wasn't a part of it. That was handled by a whole universe of people that I didn't talk to on a daily basis or a regular basis.
Okay, Eric, let me pause the action here to thank one of the sponsors of our show, and I think our wrestling listeners are really going to dig this one. Nitro, the incredible rise and inevitable collapse of Ted Turner's WCW is set to be released on July 6th. With the inside knowledge of a journalist, the perspective of a historian, and the passion of a fan, author Guy Evans provides a fresh look at an unfortunate inevitability, the downfall of World Championship Wrestling. Bolstered by exclusive interviews with over 120 TBS and WCW employees, Nitro contains a host of new revelations, including never-before-heard details of the controversial WCW sale, reported sabotage allegations, top-secret Turner executive meetings, confidential TBS memos, and what the suits really thought of wrestling on TNT in their own words. Notable interviews include Eric Bischoff, former TBS president Bill Burt, Kevin Nash, Diamond Dallas Page, and many more. Here's your website to pre-order. It's WCWNitroBook.com. That's WCWNitroBook.com, and follow them on Twitter at WCWNitroBook. At the end of the June 24th Nitro from Charlotte, Hall and Nash come through the crowd, this time with baseball bats, and that brings out a ton of cops to protect Sting, Luger, the Steiners, and the Harlem Heat, who were in a three-way tag team match. Eventually, Hall and Nash retreat to the back rather than going through the crowd. In hindsight, was that a mistake to have them go through the back instead of through the crowd?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's fair. In retrospect, probably a detail, an element of that angle that would have improved it had they gone through the crowd. I'll take that one.
Kevin Nash has told a story where he's in the back and they're being told by Turner's standards and practice that they couldn't use bats. And Kevin Sullivan was standing there and said, "Do not use baseball bats," but he was shaking his head yes the entire time while he's saying that. Do you guys remember getting in any sort of trouble or any sort of conversation with Turner afterwards about carrying the bats to the ring after they'd specifically said not to?
Probably. You know, there was a constant struggle between myself, other people within WCW, you know, on the creative side of things, and standards and practices. So, yeah, I don't remember the details of it, but it sounds like it probably happened. And it sounds like something Kevin Sullivan would do.
It also sounds like something that you could be fired for, and you know a thing or two about firing people, which is why we've got a brand new shirt over at ericbischoff.com. That's right, t-shirts for the podcast, who'd have thought? You can check it out right now at ericbischoff.com, and maybe the best debut shirt of all. You've heard about the famous way that Steve Austin was fired by FedEx? Well, we've got a shirt that says "fired" in the FedEx font and colors. This is the most fun shirt ever. Pick it up right now over at ericbischoff.com. We've also got a couple of other shirts, maybe one of my favorites, Easy Does It, and it's in that old school Easy E font. And eventually, when you pick up a shirt from ericbischoff.com, what's going to happen, Eric?
You're going to get a call. I'm following in Bruce Pritchard's lead. He is my podcast spirit animal. With his tracks. You made him a wealthy man, Mr. Thompson. So I'm gonna. I always read that if you want to be successful, follow other successful people. So that's what I'm going to do.
Well, the show, of course, is being brought to you free today. We appreciate you tuning in. Tell your friends to click the subscribe button and go ahead and leave us a review as well. But while you're at it, pick up a shirt, and then you can pick Eric's brain and grill his ass just like I am too. So you're not just getting a shirt, you're getting a great experience, and it happens at ericbischoff.com. This fired shirt might actually be my favorite podcast shirt ever. So go check it out for yourself.
I'm going to buy the first one. I really am.
Well, there you go. Kevin also says this night that you sort of made WCW look really weak, since two WWF guys with bats could hold off 6 of WCW's top stars. In hindsight, is that fair?
It's psychology, and psychology, like beauty, is in the eyes of the beholder. I think it could be interpreted that way. I think you really, you're splitting hairs. I think you need to put the whole thing in context. I think it has to be measured against what happened the following week, what the follow-up was. In retrospect, sure, we could have had all those WCW guys just beat the hell out of Hall and Nash, take the bats away from them, and beat their brains out. Storyline before you're doing a documentary, nobody cares.
Let's talk a little bit about the go-home edition here of Bash at the Beach. It's Nitro, of course, and it's July 1st. It's in Landover. Nitro's going to do a 3.7. Raw's going to do a 2.7. And this is the first time you actually refer to them by their names on TV. And they come out to start the second hour to a bit of a babyface reaction, and they sit in the front row eating popcorn. And later, they get a police escort to their car with Nash mocking them, but no interaction with their opponents that week. What's the thinking here? Is this old school, let's not let them touch? If you want to see it, you've got to buy the pay-per-view?
Part of it, it's also character development. It was furthering that storyline. They were disrupting WCW. They were there to turn it upside down. They were there to be a pain in the ass. Nothing really more to it than that. It's just to help build their characters.
One of the other things I've always wanted to ask is how you guys went about selecting who was going to be the opponents. Who was going to be the WCW representation. Mean Gene announced that it's going to be Randy Savage, Sting, and Lex Luger. And it's been said that there were really 6 in consideration: Giant, Sting, Lex, Savage, Flair, and Hogan. But we'll circle back to Hogan later. Let's save that one for now. Why not Flair? I know that it sounds like a homer when I say that. I get that. But to me, Flair was really like the WCW guy. And if they're going to be out there sort of mocking that they're old and that it's Southern and redneck and blah, 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 Flair being sort of the Southern representative of wrestling seemed to make sense to me. Why did you decide ultimately to go the other way and go Sting, Lex, and Savage?
Two reasons. One is I needed something to hold back. I needed somewhere to go. And one of my favorite questions back in the day when bookers or writers or people on the booking committee would come to me with an idea, my first question to them was, great, where's it going to go? And that's usually what you heard, absolutely nothing, because people weren't thinking about what happens next. And I knew, Ric Flair was WCW. He was as much WCW as Ted Turner was at that point. But we needed somewhere to go down the line. That was one reason. The other reason, quite frankly, is I wanted to skew a little bit younger. One of the challenges that we had in WCW at that time, from an advertising point of view, the business of the wrestling business, not the wrestling fan side of the wrestling business, but the business side of the business, advertising, is that we had to skew broader and we had to skew younger. And that's exactly what I wanted to do with the WCW division, I guess, of that equation, is to go as young as I could and leave Flair, on reserve in my back pocket, so that when we needed to take the story to the next level, he was there. And he wouldn't have been tainted by what was about to go down.
Let's talk about the week leading up to the Bash at the Beach, because Meltzer says the original plan was for Lex to be the third man, but there's also rumors out there about Tatanka, Mabel, Crush, Ryan Clark, Roddy Piper, Isaac Yankem, the British Bulldog, Bret Hart. At any point were any of these names ever discussed?
I was thinking about using Meltzer's mother, but she wasn't available. No, that's so ludicrous. And people wonder why I get hot. People wonder why Bruce gets hot. There's a perfect example of the legacy of Dave Meltzer. Where those names came from, I have no freaking idea. None. Absolutely none. There's nothing that he has ever printed that could be more stupid, more ludicrous, and more untrue than that. That's saying a lot.
Let's talk a little bit about Bret Hart, just briefly, because there's rumors, because his contract is sort of up for grabs, and you're going to be competing very soon for it. Was Bret Hart ever considered? Were you having any conversations? I mean, had you even spoken to Bret at this point about anything? Not necessarily this angle.
First, you asked two questions. The first answer is absolutely freaking not. Bret Hart was never a syllable of a syllable in any statement that was any part of any conversation as an option. Never happened. Put that one to bed. Had I talked to Bret, I don't think at that point I talked to Bret. I mean, I think I met Bret after that for the very first time. But no, at that point, it was never. The only other person that was, to me, it was always going to be the three that I chose, and Sting was going to be the guy that was going to turn, because I wasn't sure about Hulk. I know you want to talk about that later on, but I wasn't looking for anybody outside of that equation. I wasn't looking at anybody from the WWF. I wasn't looking at Dave Meltzer's mother. I wasn't going to hire, anybody that I knew from high school. None of that. It was always going to be internal.
Okay, let's actually get cooking here. You wrote this in your book about Sting. We spent 4 or 5 weeks developing the idea, giving hints and laying the groundwork, and we planned to unveil the third guy at Bash at the Beach. I didn't know myself. It had to be someone inside WCW, but beyond that, I wasn't sure. I decided to approach Sting, but I didn't know if he'd do it. Joining the Outsiders meant he'd have to turn heel. Sting had always been a very successful babyface character. Sting was receptive, not knock-me-over enthusiastic, but receptive. Everyone could see the power in this storyline was developing. Just a few weeks old, it was already one of the most interesting stories in the last 5 or 10 years, and we began seeing how the storyline might develop. I talked to him a couple of times in person and over the phone. No one else knew we were talking, not even Scott and Kevin. The identity of the third person had to be kept an extremely tight secret. I've always been curious about this, and everybody has their own opinion, Eric. How might the business have been different if Sting had been over the moon about the idea, and when you tell Kevin and Scott they're both pushing for it? Before you ever speak to Hulk, if all three guys were super enthused about it, what might that look like?
Hypotheticals are always hard, Conrad. To be fair to everybody, who knows? You know, is there a chance that angle could have been even hotter? Maybe somebody has one. Maybe somebody has that opinion. I don't. In my opinion, it would have been good. It could have even been borderline great. But I don't think it would have been something that we'd be talking about 20-some-odd years later.
Well, let's get to what we're here for. Allegedly, you visit Hulk Hogan at his house to pitch him on an idea of turning heel, and he basically showed you the door. This is a pretty famous story. Was this before or after you had the idea for the NWO?
Oh, was it like a year? Well, the idea was kind of forming in my head. And again, as a result of being over Japan and trying to do something that felt more real, as well as, you know, back when, now we're skipping around the timeline, so it's easy to get things a little confused, at least for me, even with all this caffeine. But I think it was about a year before that I pitched Hulk the idea of turning heel, partly because the babyface red and yellow thing just wasn't working. I mean, it wasn't. Hulk knew it. I knew it. Sure, you could go to center stage, or you could, you know, do a Clash of the Champions, and you get your requisite, you know, Pavlovian, you know, response where certain people at ringside would cheer, they'd wear their yellow shirts and, you know, swing their yellow foam fingers and all that. But the largest majority of the audience weren't buying it anymore, and it was apparent to everybody. And again, I knew we had to do something different. So I went to Hulk's house. I flew down. I had my own plane at the time. I flew down, met him during the week, middle of the afternoon. We sat and had a talk, probably had a beer, everything. You know, we had a really good relationship. And then I went into my pitch. And he very politely looked at his watch and said, well, you know, thanks for coming down. I got to go pick the kids up at school. And walked me to the door, and that was the end of it. He went off to go do a movie, and I went back to work. And shortly thereafter, the NWO ideas started coming, you know, materializing in my head, and Scott and Kevin, and then it was like, who's going to be the third guy? And now we're at that point in a storyline where I'm talking to Sting about that.
And eventually Hogan calls and says he wants to talk to you, so come out to LA where I'm filming a movie, Santa with Muscles. And Hogan sends a limo for you. When you get there, you arrive in his trailer, and allegedly there's beers and cigars waiting for you, and he hits you with, so brother, who's the third guy? Take it from here, Eric.
I had mixed emotions, and I remember that night pretty well, because I knew I was being, I don't want to say set up, but I knew there was a reason that he wanted me to come out and talk to me. You know, he couldn't get away from the movie set. I didn't mind going out to LA. But I knew there was something big on his mind, and I could tell by the tone in his voice when we talked on the phone that he was kind of feeling optimistic or positive. So I was pretty curious when I got there, and I suspected that it had something to do with what, you know, he was seeing. I think it was Jimmy Hart was sending him cassette tapes of Nitro at the time, so he was following along, watching what was developing. So I was curious, but I wasn't feeling there was no trepidation, you know. I was just, more than anything, I was curious. And when we sat down and, you know, cracked a beer, lit up a cigar, and he said, well, you know, who's the third guy? I don't remember word for word what my response was, but it was probably, you know, well, who do you think it should be? You know, and that's when he jumped in. Said, you're looking at it, brother, or something to that effect.
Let me ask this. Once you have a plan in place with Hogan, you decide to keep Sting as a backup plan. Is that right?
Yep.
So, were you not sold on Hogan going through with it, or or did you feel like Hogan really had more to lose, or what made you think you needed a backup plan?
Hulk would from time to time overthink things. I wasn't 100% sure that he would get back home or sit on a movie set or have somebody in his ear, have Peter Young call him and tell him, no, you can't do that, or his attorney or his wife or his kids or any number of other people that, would basically, create doubt. Because I knew it was a big move. I knew from, my previous experience, even talking to him about turning heel was a huge thing for him. And it was, it was real. It wasn't just, I don't want to be that character, brother. It was, look, I've spent 20 some odd years, building a relationship with kids and families and mothers and fathers and, children's hospitals and Make-A-Wish kids. And, he wasn't at all excited about the prospect of dumping all over that. And I understand that. He was also concerned back when I was trying to talk him into turning heel. He had kids that, were young and were in school and were going to be subjected to, kids can be kind of cruel to each other. So all those things weighed in. And I wasn't 100% sure that, 6 or 8 months that had gone by was enough to convince him that now was a good idea. So I had to have a plan B. I didn't want to get there, build a great story, and then all of a sudden the day of figure out that, well, guess what, brother? Decided against it, brother. So I wanted to make sure we had a plan B.
So when you go to Sting now, who's been pitched this idea, and it's clearly a money idea, but it is sort of out of his comfort zone too, how does he take knowing that, all due respect, it's not as big of a deal if you turn, so you're on the sidelines?
Yeah, I can't put myself in Sting's mind. I can't. My impression was that he was probably 55% of them was relieved and 45% of them was disappointed. I think it was close. I think like everybody, including Hulk, everybody saw that the story was building and building and building, and this was a moment that would have been a career-defining moment. But it was also risky. It's easy to sit back now and go, oh man, it would have been so great for him, but maybe not. We don't know. It's a hypothetical. But I think in his heart, just looking into his eyes when I told him, I had the distinct feeling that, he's a little bit relieved, but partially disappointed. Possibly because he may have thought that I didn't have the confidence in him, which wasn't true. I had a lot of confidence in him. Sting and I were pretty close friends at that point. And it didn't have anything to do with my confidence in him. It's just that, if you put Hulk Hogan turning heel on a scale and Sting turning heel on a scale, one was going to have more impact than the other. It was just straight up business.
Let's talk about some straight up business. When did you lay out the match and the promo for Hogan?
I never laid out matches. That wasn't my forte. Still wouldn't be to this day. I would lay out a story. I would say, look, guys, here's what we would like to see happen at the end. Let's work backwards from the finish. Here's what I see. You guys figure out how to do it best in the ring. I was never the guy. I was never the guy that could lay out a match. Nor did I ever think I could. But I knew where I wanted the story to go. We knew that we needed a big turn. We knew, we wanted to do it on Savage. We knew. And I left it up to the guys to lay out the match as best they could.
So I guess my question is, when do you tell Hall and Nash? When do you tell the booking committee? Who did the booking committee think it would be? Did they still think it was Sting? When did you tell them it was Hogan?
Oh, okay. I think by that time, probably a week before, is when I started letting the people that need to know. I think I let Kevin know. I know I was out in LA doing something, because Kevin and I we met for a beer over on Sunset Boulevard at a place that Peter Fonda used to own. It was a biker bar. And I think that's where I laid it out to him. Also, with the caveat that I wasn't sure if it was going to be either Hogan or Sting. One was a plan A, one was a plan B. I tried to keep it try to let him know as much as I could without letting him know definitively. Partly because I didn't know for sure, partly because I didn't want him leaking it out. So I would say about a week before is when those who needed to know started to learn. Not everybody. There were people in the booking committee that I didn't want to tell.
You said that a couple times now, that you felt like there were people on the booking committee that you couldn't really trust. What are we doing here? Let's name names. Kevin Sullivan, Greg Gagne. Who was it you couldn't trust?
Well, I couldn't trust Greg as much as I hate, it pains me to say that. I couldn't. Mike Graham was a challenge at the time. Never felt 100% comfortable in terms of keeping confidence with Terry Taylor. Kevin, I kind of, for the most part, Kevin Sullivan, for the most part, at least for a good period of time, I trusted him to keep confidence. I didn't always trust his judgment, but I trusted him to keep my confidence when it was really important. But there were a number of people that I didn't have 100% confidence in. It didn't mean that I knew for sure. It's just I was skeptical. Again, context is king. So much of everything leaked out that it had to be somebody in that booking committee. So it wasn't like I was paranoid and just creating shit in my own head. It was a challenge keeping things a secret.
Who in the company did you have confidence in? Is there anybody on the booking committee that you knew, hey, he's rock solid with me?
When Dusty was doing it, I trusted Dusty. Beyond that, no one.
You wrote in your book, as I was working through this dialogue with him, he being Hulk Hogan, pronouns pal, the name just popped into my head. I said, Hulk, when you grab that mic, I want you to say, this is the beginning of the New World Order. The word sort of sprang into my mouth, New World Order. Eric, is this your greatest freestyle ever?
I guess. I mean, here's the thing about working with Hulk. He hated scripts. He didn't like memorizing stuff. It's, part of it is just the way he grew up in the business. Part of it was just the way he wanted to feel whatever he was going to talk about when he was in the ring. He just operated on, give me the bullet points, brother, and I'll get it done kind of a basis. So there wasn't a lot of prep. I didn't have, even in my own mind going into it, I didn't have this firm idea of what I wanted him to say. I knew when he got to the building that he and I, like we had, 100 or 200 times prior, he and I would get together. More often than not, I was holding the stick for him. It was either me or Gene, and he trusted both of us. And we would get together and we'd walk through the bullet points. And then half the time he'd hit them, and half the time he'd improv. So he got to the building, and we walked through it, and it was a moment. I do recall it. I think we were in a janitor's closet because I didn't want anybody else hearing what we were talking about. And the building was crowded. There were people everywhere, and we went through it a couple times. And I remember saying it, going, "Wow, it's got a ring to it."
Kevin Sullivan has said that Hulk stayed at his house the night before, and he does this because you want to sort of keep an eye on him and keep his agent from turning him. Because allegedly, Hogan's agent at the time, Peter Young, was crying not to turn Hulk Hogan up until like 2:30 in the morning. And allegedly, everyone is telling Hogan, they're all in his ear, don't do it, it won't work, you're going to ruin all that you've built. And so Kevin actually gets into the building during the second match of the pay-per-view. This is all according to Kevin Sullivan. Is that the way you remember it that day?
Well, I wasn't there. I mean, I wasn't at Kevin Sullivan's house, and I don't know if Peter Young was crying. I don't know if any of that is true. Only the people that were there would be able to tell you that. I can tell you from my experience, it's plausible. I would say, I'd even go so far as to say it's probable. Knowing the people in Peter Young, I still talk to Peter Young all the time, and he's one of those, the sky is falling kind of guys. You know, he's like a Jewish mother. You know, he's always wanting to protect and control and just be overly protective of Hulk. Always has, probably always will. So it's probable. I don't think it's BS.
What about showing up in the second match of the pay-per-view? Does that sound right?
Yeah, because I didn't want him showing up early. I didn't want him showing up until after the pay-per-view started. Because I didn't want it to leak. I just didn't want it to get out.
No fans would see him if they're all in the building.
No fans would see him if they're all in the building, and everybody that was going to buy the pay-per-view had already purchased it.
Now, Hogan wrote in his book that you had to run the idea of him turning heel by Ted Turner, and Ted said something like, okay, give it a shot, just leave yourself an out in case it blows up in your face. Is that accurate?
No.
So no conversation with Ted about turning Hulk bad guy?
Never.
Let's get to the match itself. Hall and Nash are out without a third man, and of course they're taking on Sting, Lex Luger, and Randy Savage. Luger does the stretcher job, and Randy's taking a beating when Hogan comes out. When Hogan finally comes out in front of the crowd, is there any sense of relief in you that, hey, he's finally going to do it, this is real?
Not a sense of relief, a sense of excitement. I knew when I got done with it, going through the promo, I could tell, I knew him pretty well by that point. And I knew he was excited. There's a difference between showing up and, saying, okay, I guess we're going to do this, and showing up and saying, oh, brother, I can't wait to get this done. I mean, he was excited about it, and it was genuine, and I could read it. So I wasn't relieved that he finally did it, but I was pretty damn excited to see what the reaction was going to be.
I feel like we should take the time out here to remind everybody that while you are the former WCW president, I am in fact just a fan. I'm the mortgage guy, and as much as I love talking on wrestling, man, my real passion is helping people become homeowners. And I'd love to help you if you're a renter. Let me ask you a question. After all those payments, what do you have to show for it? Isn't it time you got something for your family? Well, First Family can make it happen right now, and you don't need perfect credit or money out of your pocket. If you're a renter, I want you to take just a few minutes and check this site out for me. I think you'll be glad you did. HideFromRent.com. That's HIDE from rent.com. I'm telling you, this is easier than you ever thought possible. If you're still in an apartment, we can finally get your family into a house of your very own. Your own backyard for your kids. A garage for your stuff. But maybe best of all, a kitchen big enough to host Thanksgiving, a chimney for Santa Claus. Whatever you're looking for your family, First Family can make it happen. And you don't need perfect credit to do this. Even with scores in the 500s, we can make this happen. But maybe best of all, you don't need any money out of pocket. You see, if you found another apartment you like today, you'd have to pay your first month's rent, your last month's rent, and a security deposit. But we can get you into a brand new home with no money down. It sounds too good to be true, but we can do it for you right now at HideFromRent.com. NMLS number 65084, Equal Housing Lender. Was there any doubt before he showed up in the building that day, at least in your mind, that he might flip-flop? I mean, did you not know he was locked in until you saw him that day?
True.
So,
Terry Hulk has talked a lot about his personal life and a lot of the stuff that he had to go through during that time. His wife was tough on him, and she had her own ideas about the wrestling business, like everybody else who's ever watched it on television and never really done it. She had very strong opinions about what was right and wrong and what was good for Hulk and good for the family and what wasn't. And I knew that. I mean, I'd been around him at that point quite a bit, both he and Linda. So I was a little bit concerned about that. It wouldn't have been unusual for Hulk to show up to the building and say, brother, just not going that well, brother, for him to change his mind, whether he revealed that it was Linda being his ear or not. So yeah, I was concerned about it.
Sort of a silly question, I guess, but I feel like it's justified given what you just said. When the match started, did the other 5 guys in the match know?
Yes.
I asked because Hogan, of course, has did the old, or I guess rather Scott Hall has done the old, we didn't know until he showed up for sure. We knew he'd been asked, but we weren't finally decides, okay, Eric, I'm going to turn heel. Does he have a contingency plan? Have you guys got a backup plan?